kind of amusing and somewhat horrifying that, people who sort of allege they speak in the name of the marginalized, and they're through their actions and their words trying to help them. They're not helping them at all. In fact, they're alienating them. Hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot podcast. I'm your host, Ruy Teixeira, and we specialize here in having the very finest and heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And boy, we got one in spades today, Musa Al-Gharbi, someone whose work I greatly admire and hopefully some of you encountered before. He is a assistant professor of communications and journalism at Stony Brook. He's a columnist for both Compact Magazine and The Guardian, I believe. And, Musa has published in a zillion places. I won't list them all here, but he's all over the place. And most important of all, he has a new book. It's called We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. And, if I may have a sort of multi-pronged plug here, I would say if you read my book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone, Patrick Ruffini's book, Party of the People, and Musa's book, new book, We Have Never Been Woke, I guess it's out in early October, you would pretty much know what you need to know about where American politics is at today. I think you'd be very well prepared. So why don't you guys out there in podcast land all do that, and there'll be a short quiz later. But meanwhile, we'll have a little chat with Musa. Before we get into your book, Musa, about the societal dominance of knowledge economy professionals and the paradoxical ideology with which they justify their dominance, how did you come to write it? What interested you in the subject? What propelled you, including from your personal experience, to try to look at things with this lens?
Yeah, so I've been interested for a while in questions about knowledge in a broader sense, especially when I first started academia. I was interested in questions about metaphysics and stuff, like the structure and nature of reality. I was a philosopher, and then I had a twin brother, and he was killed in Afghanistan. And yes. After that, I started focusing more on what you might call political questions, with the aim of helping other families avoid the kind of tragedy that my own family was working through. And so I shifted to applied social epistemology. So that's what do we know in virtue of what, with a tight focus on national security and foreign policy questions. And then gradually, my interest expanded beyond just national security, foreign policy stuff, looking at social movements in the United States, U.S. political elections, things like this. But then, one dimension of what interested me in these questions is I've just had this kind of long-standing interest in knowledge and how we produce knowledge together and how we understand the world, and that led me to gradually pay more and more scrutiny to the institutions and the people that produce knowledge, and kind of what's going on with us.
It just doesn't fall from the sky, does it?
Absolutely. And then secondly, I would say the second big factor is that after I moved to, gradually, so I was a philosopher, and then I realized that some of the questions I had, I couldn't really answer them just sitting in my armchair, thinking hard. They were empirical questions that required different tools than a philosopher typically uses. And so I decided to shift into social science, and starting with my time at Columbia where I pursued a PhD in sociology. And while I was there, so that was a big culture shock. The experience of moving from the small military town I lived in to moving to the Upper West Side of Manhattan in these elite institutions just before the onset of the 2016 election. I found the whole experience, especially after Trump was elected, disorienting, because in the community I came from, it's a county that helps keep the state red. Arizona was, when I was growing up, was a decisively red state that has grown more purple over time. But Cochise County, in fact, George Packer just has a new article in The Atlantic about Phoenix, but he spends some time talking about Cochise County, which is where I'm from, and how it's still like a bastion of kind of deep red America. And it makes sense. It's but so moving from there to a district that went 95-5 Clinton was a big change.
From being surrounded by people who like voting for Trump was not a big deal to people who would think, you're like an alien from Mars if you voted for Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was kind of navigating this big political difference, these big kind of cultural and socioeconomic differences and stuff. And I was left, especially after the 2016 election, I talk a little bit in the book about my disorientation, because this was, again, I'd only been living there for a couple months, and then Trump got elected, and it was wild. It was wild at Columbia. One of the things that was wild to me, for instance, we had a class on social theory, and we were supposed to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the only black theorist we were going to talk about that whole semester. Rather than talking about Du Bois, though, we instead had a rap session where we sat around talking about our feelings after the election, and there were grown men who were weeping. There were white ladies who were married to Korean dudes who were talking about how Trump was going to put their half Korean kids in camps, as if that's what he's been campaigning on, is rounding up all the half Korean kids.
Absolutely, and, that's his thing.
And it was striking to me. There were a few things that were like really striking to me about this moment at Columbia and in Manhattan more broadly. One of them being, according to the students and not just the students for that matter, the professors and a lot of the staff who were enabling this. So according to a lot of but according to their own narratives about what would happen if Trump got elected, that the rich and the powerful would have more influence than ever and the little guy would get crushed underfoot. Well, we were at Columbia University. We are not the little guy. We're the winners in that story. The story that we told about who would stand to benefit the most. We're the winners. But there was almost zero awareness of this, and instead a lot of Columbia students, students who were themselves typically from affluent families, and when they weren't from affluent families, in virtue of being at Columbia, they were on track to be affluent themselves. They were depicting themselves as the little guy, as vulnerable and disadvantaged, as being the kind of big, as being uniquely susceptible to Trump and his regime. And then there were, so that I found puzzling, and it was even more puzzling because all around us at Columbia were a whole bunch of other workers who do things like scrubbing the toilets and serving the food and trimming the hedges. And these workers seemed to be completely invisible to basically all of the academic stakeholders. So there were a lot of students who said they were too traumatized and they needed time off. And they were asking for...
Meanwhile, the janitors have to come into work, and and they're okay with it, right? I mean, it's like...
Yeah, the janitors showed up the next day. They weren't sobbing uncontrollably as they were scrubbing the rich kids' mess out of the toilet. They just showed up the next day and did their job. And the striking thing is, these other workers were the people in our own narratives about who were the winners and who were the losers. Right. These were the people who had the most to lose in our narratives from Trump being elected. They were overwhelmingly black and Hispanic. They were from lower income backgrounds. A lot of them were immigrants. And so in our own stories, these are the people that we should have been most concerned about after Trump's election if our stories of the world were true. But they were invisible to us. Not only were they not, they were invisible to us. We were mostly focused on ourselves and how we feel and how sad we are and how, we were weeping for the marginalized. Like, if you went out to Manhattan, you leave Columbia and you go to the Upper West Side of Manhattan in general, there are people walking around with safety pin buttons and crying to each other, like walking around like a bomb went off.
I know. And, I just got to laugh, man. It is wild, you're right.
Yeah, and they couldn't even cook dinner for themselves because they were too distraught. So they had the same people who were the losers,
right.
and who did show up to work the next day and just did their jobs, who were catering to them even more than usual because they were just too distraught about the marginalized and the disadvantaged to cook for themselves or clean for themselves or take care of basic responsibilities for their lives. And so, like, being here in the aftermath of the election was like one of the things that really started me like thinking like, okay, what's actually happening here? What are we actually like? What's going on here when they're evoking this?
You didn't quite buy their rap, or you started to get a little suspicious.
Yeah, it started to kind of create this worm in my own brain that came to haunt me for the next several years about kind of like this question of basically like, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? And that's basically the question the book is trying to wrestle with: is what are we doing here when we talk about social justice, when we make these appeals to social justice and so on.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I mean, so you describe in your book the rise of these to dominance and increased dominance of these knowledge economy professionals, or as you call them, symbolic capitalists. And, the way in which they embrace, what we might loosely call wokeness to legitimate their position. How did it happen? I mean, how did they manage to get to this dominant position? And how in particular did they embrace this paradoxical ideology of, we're the tribunes of the oppressed, and in fact, we're kind of oppressed ourselves, as opposed to having any kind of like realistic appreciation of their position.
Absolutely. I think... So part of the story here is that a lot of the symbolic professions, so fields like academia, law, journalism, and so on, a lot of them have defined themselves from the outset as being a check on elites, as being so journalists, for instance, are supposed to be a voice for the voiceless and speak truth to power and, be the fourth estate that helps hold elites to account and so on. And so it's really the fact that we define ourselves in this way and think of ourselves in this way itself can serve as a kind of mental block that prevents us from understanding ourselves as elites. Like, we're the people who check elites. We're not the elites.
Yeah, and I think those are the other people. It's a 1%. Those are the real enemy. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think that's part of the problem. Another part of the story, I think, is... there were these big changes in the global economy after the 60s that favored what you might call the knowledge industries. And because a lot of these professions from the outset, so it's not just journalism, like academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads without respect to anyone's political interests or monetary interests and so on. And you can just go down the line. Lawyers have their own kind of canons of ethics, psychologists, go down the list. Because a lot of these professions define themselves from the jump in terms of serving the marginalized and the disadvantaged and serving the common good, like the pay that we get, the unusual pay that we get, the unusual prestige that we have compared to other workers, the autonomy that we enjoy on our jobs compared to other workers. From the outset, we've said the reason you should give us those things is because if you do, it will be good for everyone in society because we serve the greater good. We're these altruistic professions, and it'll serve everyone, and including and especially the vulnerable and the desperate and the dispossessed and so on. And so because our pay and our autonomy and our status have been justified in this way from the beginning of a lot of our fields, this created this unique form of competition within the symbolic professions, where people seem even more worthy of their position, or they seem even more worthy of their status, they more worthy of pay and respect and all of this, to the extent that they successfully paint themselves as being champions of the marginalized and the disadvantaged, or being altruistic and serving the common good. And on the flip side, people who are successfully painted as being in the pocket of elites, or who are successfully painted as being of holding the wrong views about race and gender and sexuality and so on, those people can often find themselves in a precarious position, often find themselves seeing significant losses in status and respect, or even lose their jobs altogether, become unemployable in the symbolic professions, get canceled in the contemporary parlance. And so this form of status competition has been part of the symbolic professions for more than a century now. This is one of the things that I highlight in the book, and I try to show a lot of examples. A lot of people think that contemporary struggles over social justice and identitarian concerns are something new. They've been going on for a century now. One thing that's a little bit newer is that after the 1960s, as a result of the Civil Rights Act and Title IX and other things like this, it no longer became acceptable to engage in like blatant racial and sexual discrimination in these fields. Before that, a lot of these fields were restricted to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of a certain pedigree, and they were unapologetic about this. Like the American Bar Association explicitly banned black doctors and went out of its way to interfere with the formation of black parallel infrastructures. They were shameless about, like, it wasn't a secret, or these were jobs for WASPs. So after that started being eroded in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act, Title IX, and other legislation like this, and the symbolic professions began becoming more diverse, this created a different form of status competition because there were a growing number of people who started getting folded into these professions who not only could say, I'm a champion for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, but I am myself a representative of, I'm a living embodiment of these groups and the oppression that they have experienced over time. And so that created a kind of arms race in the symbolic professions where people now are not just trying to identify as advocates and champions and allies for marginalized and disadvantaged groups, but they're trying to find ways to count themselves as as a member of those groups. So
Me
you
too.
see these.
I'm one.
So
a couple of things about that that I think you actually touch on in the book that kind of accentuate that is, one, these periodic, not crises, but surges and overproduction of elites. That just, obviously, if we got too many of these people, they got to differentiate themselves from each other and figure out a way to get a labor market advantage. And so one way to do that is the kind of stuff we're talking about. A second thing is, you just talked about the decline in overt racism and sexism. And, I think really, there's been a lot of improvement. So,
Yes.
But if you're like one of these knowledge economy professionals and you want to get on the train and maximize your advantages, you've got to find other ways.
Yeah.
Other than like not being overtly racist. You've got to like police people's language. You've got to have ever more arcane vocabulary and ideas to deal with these, very subtle forms of oppression that only you, people like you, can understand. So it seems like those things kind of enhance that whole dynamic that's led to some of the weirdness that we've seen.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's this, you want to differentiate yourself by being even more committed, even more extreme, even more, or on the flip side, as you said, being able to pick out even more subtle distinctions and follow even more arcane, refined codes that other people can't know or follow correctly, and that helps distinguish you as the person who has the right kind of pedigree and the right kind of motives compared to these other people who can't keep up with the changing norms. So that's definitely a big part of the story about how social justice discourse functions in practice, regardless of intent. Like a big way it operates in the world, just in reality, is that it helps mark certain people as being part of the in club, as being worthy of being listened to, and then other people as being in the out club and worthy of being ignored and disdained and marginalized and excluded.
Whatever I think about this stuff, and as you're so ably outlining it, is, yes, all these codes, they become ever more arcane. There's more competition to be on the right side of them. And in the meantime, the relationship between those ways of thinking and doing and talking and the actual oppressed get ever more, they diverge ever more. Like most working class people, when they hear these people rattling on about this stuff, it's like, what are they talking about?
Yeah.
It's like, who are these people? So it's just kind of amusing and somewhat horrifying that people who sort of allege they speak in the name of the marginalized, and they're through their actions and their words trying to help them. They're not helping them at all.
Yeah.
In fact, they're alienating them. So, and
they alienate them for a few reasons. One, one way in which people get alienated is because a lot of people recognize that, it's like this kind of weird symbolic stuff that doesn't really matter or mean anything in a tangible way for their lives. So a lot of people recognize that. We don't necessarily fully recognize that a lot of times when we're engaging in these behaviors, but other people who are not us readily perceive readily perceive this.
Not that hard.
And so that's part of it. And then part of it too is like one deep tension in the way that we sometimes promote social justice is that, as you said, a lot of these modes of thinking and talking are not. They're not the language of the trailer park or the slum or the or the people who are being like actively stigmatized and can't participate in society as full members and so on and so forth.
As William Julius Wilson used to put it, the truly disadvantaged.
Yes, and not only is it not the language of the truly disadvantaged, but ironically, the truly disadvantaged are some of the people who are most likely to be excluded as a result of so an example that I talk about in some of my work, for instance, is that in fields like higher ed, in the name of diversity and inclusion, a lot of progressives are really intolerant to people who say the wrong things about race or gender or sexuality, or who have traditional values or conservative views in the world, who believe in religious views and stuff like this. The problem with striking this posture in the name of diversity and inclusion is that when you look at who actually suffers as a result of these policies, it tends to be the very people we claim that we're trying to help. So it's just a fact, like highly educated white liberals and whites from affluent backgrounds and stuff are not the ones who suffer the most from these policies. They're the ones who are most like the people in America who are most likely to subscribe to the dominant view are highly educated white people. It's people from non-traditional college backgrounds, people who are immigrants, people who are non-white, people who are religious minorities. Those are the people who are most likely to subscribe to socially conservative and religious views and so on. So if we create an environment that's hostile to those views, it's people who are already underrepresented in these institutions who end up suffering the most, who end up getting excluded the most. And when you make it easier to fire people for thinking and saying and feeling the wrong thing, as I show in some of my published work, it actually tends to be professors who are adjuncts, contingent faculty members instead of the privileged tenure line people, people who are women and minorities who end up getting fired the most for their political speech when you make it easier to punish deviance from the prevailing norm. And academia is not unique in this regard. There are other studies by Frank Dobbin that showed, for instance, that in the private sector, if you make it easier to fire managers, but if you set up these kind of grievance procedures that allow people to anonymously report and sanction their bosses, it turns out when you create these policies, and they're often created, again, in the name of diversity and inclusion, in the name of helping more vulnerable people be able to stand up to more powerful people, when you look at who actually gets punished and fired when these laws get put into place, when these rules get put into place, it tends to be managers who are women and non-whites. So these policies have basically zero impact on white men as managers. They have a very small impact on white women as managers. They have a much bigger impact on non-white women and the biggest impact on non-white men. They're the ones who end up getting fired and demoted and punished. And so this is a system that's in part because, again, relatively affluent people from the dominant group and so on, they're the ones who know what the correct thing is to say and how the correct way is to act, and they execute the scripts in accordance with how they should. And more than that, they're more likely to personally believe and subscribe to a lot of these views in the first place. And so if you make it easier, again, to kind of punish people who deviate from mainstream symbolic capitalists' preferred modes of talking and behaving in the world, it's actually non-whites and people from non-traditional backgrounds, people who are already underrepresented, who end up getting pushed out and punished and censored and silenced in the name of diversity and inclusion. Richly
ironic. And I think in your book, I think you make very clear that, one way of interpreting this, I guess, would be it's just kind of a mistake. They really do want to help the oppressed, and they're just kind of making a mistake in how they go about it. But you have I think, a harder edge thesis. It's kind of like whether they consciously admit it or not, as it were, they really are maintaining their privilege. This is a system to maintain their position, secure it, and essentially hoard opportunities and structural advantages. And that has gone on for long enough. We can't just consider it like kind of a momentary mistake. This has a functional value for those elites.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I argue in the book is, if you look at the social life of social justice discourse, regardless, again, of whether or not people want it to work this way in principle, how it does work in practice, absolutely, is it. We leverage social justice discourse in our power struggles to advance our own ends, to enhance our own status, to justify why people who are the losers in the knowledge economy deserve to lose. Right. So we can ignore
those dummies.
The people who are suffering, who live in flyover country, who are more sociologically distant from us, who vote for the wrong people and whatever. They deserve. If they're suffering, good. They deserve it. If they feel like they are unrepresented in our institutions, we don't need to listen to them. They're racist. Right. They're sexist.
Last thing we want to do is represent them.
They deserve to be under. In fact, we should marginalize them more, right? And so we're using social justice discourse, and when we do that, we're using social justice discourse to actually justify inequalities. That's what we're doing in practice, whether or not that's what we intend to do. And but one of the things that I try to stress in the book is that the fact that we use social justice in these instrumental ways, in ways to enhance our own ends, to make our enemies suffer, and so on, the fact that we leverage it in these ways, that's not necessarily incompatible with the idea that we sincerely believe them. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the things that I try to stress in the book is like there's this narrative, it's this like deeply seated assumption that we make a lot of times that either you sincerely believe something or you're using it to your advantage. If you can show that someone has an interest in believing something or preaching some, or espousing something, then they must be cynical or insincere or something like this. But
not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of best evidence we have from the cognitive and behavioral sciences and other fields like that is that our cognitive and perceptual systems are kind of at a very fundamental level, kind of oriented towards enhancing our own interests and furthering our goals. So we literally like perceive the world in ways that serve our interests.
It's evolution, baby. I gotta survive.
And so if we embrace that understanding of the world, then there's not really a tension between us believing something, using it instrumentally and believing it sincerely. Like if we had an interest in believing something or getting other people to believe something, we would actually be more likely to sincerely believe it ourselves and to try to encourage other people to sincerely believe it too. So there's not actually a tension between us being sincere in our commitments to social justice as we understand it, while also like deploying it in these power struggles and to serve our own interests and undermine our enemies and so forth. The problem is that to the extent that we don't really pay a lot of attention to the role that we occupy in society, to the ways that our own actions and behaviors and things like this contribute to the social problems that we're creating, then these kinds of stories that we tell ourselves about how we're on the right side of history and we're advocates for the marginalized and the disadvantaged and so on, these stories that we tell can blind us to how the problems that we're concerned about persist. They can make it difficult for us to address those problems in an effective way. And in our case, the fact that we have this kind of these competing desires to, on the one hand, be an elite and to have other people defer to us and to enjoy a higher standard of living than most other people and have our children reproduce our own social position or be even better off than us. This desire to be an elite, which is deeply sincere and deeply held, is in fundamental tension with this other desire we have to promote social justice and help the oppressed be liberated and the poor be uplifted and so on. Like, you can't really be an egalitarian social climber. Those two things are in fundamental tension. And when these drives come into conflict, these two sincere drives we have come into conflict, it's usually our desire to be elites that wins out and kind of distorts the ways that we approach social justice, such that we end up trying to pursue social justice mainly in ways that don't require us to sacrifice anything or change anything about our lives. Like, we try to look for, how can we just somehow take things from other people or push those people even further down a hole and somehow solve these social problems that we're concerned about. And a big message of the book is it's actually not possible for us to achieve a lot of the things we say we want to achieve by just focusing on the top 1% or Trump voters. We can push Trump voters even further to the margins, all the way to the margins. We can push them out of the country. We can literally push them out of the country. If you look at where some of these problems are most acute, they're actually places that Democrats control with basically one-party rule. So New York and California, for instance, you have extreme amounts of wealth. They're some of the wealthiest states in the country. 1 out of every 12 people or more is a millionaire in New York and California and states like that. But you also have the highest rates of poverty, among the highest rates of poverty in the country, extreme inequality, extreme residential segregation, and so on. And so you have these like overwhelmingly liberal cities and states that have really high rates of racialized segregation, much higher than in kind of more red states and so on. So you can literally you could push all of the Trump people out of the, like literally out of the country. An alien could come down and abduct them all. And it wouldn't actually solve a lot of these problems, which are especially acute in blue cities and blue states.
Well, and in the meantime, Musa, I mean, it's also correct, right, that there is a strong relationship between this kind of privilege hoarding and this kind of ideology and the dominance of these knowledge economy professionals and how they choose to run blue states and cities and Trumpism itself, right? I mean, it's the other side of the coin. There's the sort of ideology and dominance practices of elites is precisely what gave rise to Trumpism in many ways, even though people like us don't like to admit it. But that's a lot what's going on here. And obviously it not only happened, it persists, right? Here we are 8 years after the 2016 election, and we're still on a knife's edge between Trumpian populism and what you might call knowledge economy professional Democratic Party. So they're not winning, they're in a political sense, they're not winning. And in theory, they have all these wonderful progressive things they want to do. They're even stymied from doing that because of this sort of almost weird symbiotic relationship between Trumpism and sort of liberal knowledge economy professionals.
Well, and this relationship we see in the current moment actually repeats over time as well. So this is one thing I argue in the book, is like awakenings are usually followed by culture wars. Like awakenings usually descend into culture wars and are followed by kind of right-leaning gains at the ballot box. And the reason why this happens is because even under normal times, symbolic capitalists, people who work in these fields like journalism and law and the media and tech and finance and so on, consultants, we tend to have political views that are very different than kind of normie America, even under normal times.
Yes, there used to be a lot fewer of us, though.
Yes, absolutely. And then during these periods of awakening, the gap between us and other people grows because we shift a lot. They don't shift much. Most of the rest of America hasn't shifted much, actually, on a lot of these issues over the last 10 years. And to the extent that they've shifted, they've actually become more progressive in many respects on things like embracing LGBTQ people, feminist attitudes. And the reason the gap continued to grow isn't because those people have become more extreme and racist and sexist and so on. They've typically become less if they've changed at all. The gap continued to grow because we had this radical shift we shifted a lot. And so during these periods of great awakening, the gap between us and other people, which is always big, gets really big. It also becomes a lot more salient in people's minds because we become a lot more militant about villainizing and demeaning and trying to censor everyone who disagrees with us, then this kind of gap between us and other people, which under ordinary circumstances they might not love, but they might just not really care about, it's not a huge problem. It becomes more of a problem. We make it a problem. We actually make it a problem by becoming a lot more confrontational, intolerant, and demeaning towards everyone who disagrees with us during these periods. And so what you end up seeing is this creates an opportunity for right-aligned political actors, typically, to basically campaign on vowing to bring people like us under control. We're going to restore these institutions to their proper purpose. They've lost their way. They're not educating, for instance. They're engaged in indoctrination. They're not reporting. They're engaged in activism,
right.
and
That's
so
what
on.
I'm voting for.
And so,
right. Yeah.
And so this
you could write
this
the
kind
script.
these gains with people like Ron DeSantis and so on in the recent cycle. You see the same thing playing out in cycle after awakening. And not only do you see these gains for the right, which tend to be both bad for us and our institutions, and also bad for a lot of the causes we care about. But on top of that, we often see the creation of these basically parallel infrastructures of knowledge production. So after the 1960s, for instance, there was this, after that awakening, there was a sense that higher ed was lost. You can't fix it. And so what did they do? They started creating right-leaning think tanks, starting with Cato and the Heritage Foundation. And then after the late 80s to early 90s awakening, the last one before this one, when we had the big blow-ups about PC culture, they called it that.
Right, early
not
90s,
wokeness. Yeah. So in the aftermath of that, they were like, well, the media is lost. There's no way to fix the media. So what did they do? They launched Fox News, which is now eating everyone's lunch. They're the number one. It's not even close. And in the current moment, you see these moves by people like Elon Musk to take over Twitter, or Trump to launch Truth Social, or Peter Thiel to buy Rumble, and so on. And the problem for us, for mainstream symbolic capitalists, is that when we see that a lot of these new alternative knowledge production things that get created, the way that they make money, the way that they get eyeballs, the way that they get audiences, is by basically continuing to sow mistrust in our institutions. So how does Fox News get viewers? By all day, every day, 24/7, saying mainstream media is corrupt, they're biased, and so on and so forth. How does do think tanks, these right-leaning social media spaces, all of them, they have an existential stake in sowing the culture wars constantly, and in sowing consistent mistrust in mainstream institutions and in mainstream experts. And you can see one of the lasting effects of these periods of great awakening tends to be increased mistrust in institutions. And so to the extent that during these periods, we get way out of touch with normal people, and we become really unpalatable to normal people, to the extent that we create this moment of opportunity for these political entrepreneurs and grifters and so on, we actually suffer long-term consequences for it. And it's not just us that suffer. So, for instance, there's a political scientist, Matt Moda, who has a paper that came out showing that so after Trump was elected, a lot of scientists decided to protest as scientists, like wearing white coats and stuff like this, saying, I'm a scientist, and as a scientist, Trump is bad. So there was this March for Science.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, where people were... Okay, so as Moda shows, the main consequence of the March for Science, it didn't cause anyone to trust science more. It didn't cause them to want to support science or oppose Trump. It just caused people to trust scientists less.
Right.
And this was highly consequential, because scientists engaged in this behavior that caused people to trust them less right before the onset of a major global pandemic, when trust in science was actually really important. Like there are probably people who are dead now who would be alive today if scientists hadn't done this indulgent crap that kind of polarized perceptions of science and undermined trust in scientists. There are probably people who literally died, who wouldn't have died if people felt more comfortable trusting expertise and had higher faith in institutions. So to the extent that we engage in these kinds of indulgent behaviors that alienate other people, it often has consequences for people who, not just for us, but for other people, especially people who are vulnerable, who are disadvantaged, who are sociologically distant from us. If you look at COVID mortality rates, if you look at who died the most, like it was African Americans, poor people who live in rural areas, so people who are already disadvantaged, who already feel distant from us, and who often feel uncertain about following our advice in the first place. To the extent that we alienated those people even more by engaging in these kinds of ridiculous displays, it could have literally cost them their lives. And so to the extent that we actually think the work we do matters, to the extent that we think it's important for people to actually listen to us and take us seriously, then we should behave in a manner that befits that, that reflects this reality, right?
Yeah, I mean, an interesting aspect of the salience of cultural alienation, which I think is very clear, and you've eloquently spoken to it, and there's a lot in your book, of course. I find it fascinating. On the one hand, this is obviously a big deal, a big divergence, a big split, a big problem. But simultaneously, as a lot of people realize this, and sort of among liberals on the left and the Democratic Party, they have this kind of touchingly naive theory that if they simply talk to people more about their economic interests and don't do anything about the cultural distance or cultural alienation, that will solve the problem, right? And yet these are the same people who, as they're thinking this ludicrous idea to me, they are people for whom cultural values are incredibly important. Yes. It's like what they talk and think about all the time. It's what they get most passionate about. And yet they think the working class should like basically give them a pass on their cultural alienation, and sort of don't worry about any of that stuff. We're going to have these great programs. We're going to help you. We're on your side. It does not compute to me. I mean, if you live a life where these cultural things are so important to you, why don't you think they're important to the working class? Yeah. Why don't you think that maybe there's a need to, reduce that cultural distance, not do and say stupid things? So, pardon the rant, but it really is kind of striking when you think about it.
I mean, so there's one of the problems with trying to sidestep some of the cultural stuff and just focus on, so rather than trying to close the gaps between us and normies on cultural issues, and instead trying to just pretend that stuff isn't the case, I think not foregrounding that stuff can help. But it doesn't really eliminate the problem, because other people recognize and perceive that there is this distance. So if we're not rubbing that distance in their faces, that's probably better than if we're choosing to rub it in their faces. But that said, better still would be trying to actually build bridges and build trust. But instead of doing that, just trying to sweep it under the rug and pretend it doesn't happen and focus on economics. One problem with this is that, a lot of bread and butter issues are tough to tease out from some of these moral and political cultural questions. So on immigration, for instance, like there's definitely an economic component to immigration policy, involving like getting the right labor force, getting the right mix of people who are working to support people who are retired. Like there are all sorts of economic dimensions to immigration, but there are also important cultural dimensions that are never going to go away, that you have to reckon with one way or another, and that are definitely salient in a lot of voters' minds when they approach these, when they think about immigration and confront questions about immigration. And so to the extent that people don't speak to those concerns, that's often not helpful. And in fact, a great example that also comes to mind is in the case of criminal justice reform. So, for instance, a lot of Black people and not just black people, non-whites in general, lower income people in general, but sticking with African Americans, a lot of African Americans have real safety concerns. They have like needs that are not being addressed. They want better policing, but but they don't want less policing.
No, they want more and better.
More and better. And in many cases, they don't support policies like decarceration, abolishing prisons, and things like this. In part because where are those prisoners going to go if they get out of prison? They're not going to be moving to the Upper West Side of Manhattan. They're going to be
Bethesda,
moving
Maryland. That's not where they're going to be hanging out. Yeah.
And so, and there's a sociologist, Matthew Desmond, who himself is a prison abolitionist, but he recognizes that there is this deep problem where a lot of times people who advocate for things like prison abolition don't speak to people's actual concerns, to their real concerns.
Well, how can he be a prison abolitionist then? What's the deal? I don't get it.
And so,
anyway, parenthetical.
Yeah, so he has this great story, this great essay called Beyond the Easiest Cases, where he highlights this point, like what a lot of progressive activists do when they talk about things like abolition, is they focus on people who are like nonviolent offenders who, you had small amounts of weed on you a couple of times and now you're locked up for life. And we often assume that this is the majority of people who are locked up in prison.
Yeah, not true.
And we assume that if other people don't want to let that person out of prison, then it must just be because they're sadistic and evil or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, when you look at who the majority of people in prison in the United States are, who are serving long sentences in prison or who are just in prison in general, they're often like people who committed crimes like rape and assault and murder. Or who were involved in like heavy drug trafficking that hollowed out and ravaged communities. Not people who just had a gram of pot on them, but people who were involved in like significant drug trafficking. And these are the overwhelming majority of people in prison, are people who committed grievous offenses and are often repeat offenders. And people have a lot of concerns. If you want to get rid of prisons and abolish prisons, what's going to happen with those people, with the rapists and the murderers and the people who committed assaults and the people who ravaged out our communities with fentanyl and other drugs? Again, especially people who would communities who would end up hosting those people in practice because they're not moving to the rich white neighborhoods when they get out of jail, right?
Yeah.
And so Desmond argues that like people who want to engage in who want to support prison abolition, like he does, they need to focus on the tough cases, on what do you do with those people. They need to speak to the actual concerns that people have instead of imputing a bunch of fake concerns, like they just are sadists who want to punish people for no reason, and they enjoy the fact that this poor nonviolent offender is spending their life in prison, and so on. That's not the concerns that people have. And if you don't actually recognize and address people's real concerns, you're not going to make progress on the issue.
It reminds me of this well-known book, I imagine you know it too, Michael Javin Fortner, The Black Silent Majority, about the reaction in black communities against the crack cocaine epidemic and the relationship of that to some of the more draconian crime regulation things that came down the pike in the 90s, which of course, is all blamed now on Clinton or whatever. But it's fascinating. I mean, if you talk, the actual people who are actually affected by this stuff usually have really different points of view than the people who have these sort of outre boutique positions on how to eliminate these social pathologies. I mean, it's pretty strange.
It's strange, and part of the problem is symbolic capitalists, when they want to know what do black people think about criminal justice issues, they don't usually do things like conduct nationally representative polls. They don't try to seek nationally representative polls and surveys to find out what the modal African American thinks about things, or they don't go into poor communities and just talk to people about their concerns and priorities. Instead, what they do is they look at one of their peers who writes for somewhere like the New York Times or the Atlantic. What does a black person, what does Ta-Nehisi Coates think about criminal justice reform, instead of what does Hannah Nicole Jones say, instead of looking at the people that they're actually trying to help. And the problem with making this move is that it's typically the case that people who are part of these institutions, who might identify with a marginalized or disadvantaged population in some way, but they're not terribly representative of those groups. They just don't reflect their needs. They don't have the same interests. They don't have the same values. And demonstrably, they are not representative.
No, class position's completely different.
Yeah. And so as an example, I was on a panel with there were four other black people. There were four black people on this panel, this event they had to discuss polarization and stuff. Okay, the four black people that they had were me, who has my mom is white. So they had me, two Jamaicans of like second generation or first generation, depending on the person, origin, and then someone who was a Kenyan and Nigerian reporter. And so like the a representative a representative sample of Black America, we were not.
Yeah, definitely not. Definitely not.
Kind of monoracial, non-immigrant Black America was just not represented on the panel at all, let alone having people on that panel who were monoracial, non-immigrant Black people from non-elite institutions, working class backgrounds, and so on and so forth. That's not, and so the panel, it wasn't representative of Black America as a whole, but it was perfectly representative of how most of these discussions about Black America, when they fold Black people into these conversations, it's people like us who are not, just not we're not particularly representative of Black America. And so this is one of the things that I would urge symbolic capitalists to do, a message that I hope they maybe implicitly take from the book, is that if you want to help someone, it's important to find out what the people you're trying to help actually want. Not what they should want, not what other elites who happen to identify with those groups, what they want, which is often, flattering for your own position, but not representative of, actually do a little bit of, actually do research to find out what those people want, and try to help them get what they want, even if it's not what you would wish, even if it's not something that you agree with. Because when we try to overrule, when we assume we know better, when we try to, we often cause great harm to the people that we're trying to help, or we advocate for policies that just don't achieve their desired ends.
Work that well. Musa, you've written also recently about, are things getting better? Basically, I guess that's my question. If you did you've done some study that shows, and other people have done similar things, that sort of the ostentatious wokeness, so to speak, has declined in a lot of places, including in academia. You can look at sites and newspapers. A lot of things. So it kind of peaked in 2021, 22, and so it's gone down since then. But how much have things really changed in a more substantive sense? Are the knowledge economy professionals so entrenched in their point of view and in the institutions and in their control, in a sense, of the Democratic Party, that not much is really changing, despite the fact we're past the peak of a certain kind of peak of wokeness? For example, look at the Harris campaign, right? You were just writing about that in Compact today. Is this not a quintessential knowledge economy professional campaign? How much has really changed, even despite the fact we're not quite at 2021 levels anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of symbolism, right, there is a dramatic difference between Kamala Harris and her previous front. Like Hillary Clinton in 2016, the scene that's like burned into my brain that I can never purge, no matter how hard I try, is that while campaigning against Bernie Sanders, she was at one point like, if we broke up the big banks tomorrow, would that end racism? Would that end sexism? And the crowd roared back, no, and cheered and stuff. And of course, Hillary Clinton's policies were also not going to end racism or end sexism.
You mentioned it,
But so she leaned really heavily into this identitarian stuff. And for that matter, to a lesser degree, but non-trivially, so did Joe Biden. Like if I don't drink, but if people did a drinking game where every time Joe Biden said systemic racism, you took a sip.
You'd be pretty toasted, man.
You'd be in a lot of trouble, right? Whereas for Kamala Harris, she would be the first female president, only the second black president, the first South Asian president, and so on and so forth. So she's a historic candidate, but you don't see her talking about this kind of stuff all day, every day. So on symbolically, she's very different than her predecessors. But in terms of substance, one, it's really hard to know, frankly, what Kamala's substance is,
If you figure it out, let me know.
She hasn't been forthright with her a lot of the previous positions she held that were unpopular. She distanced herself from those, but without really explaining what her current posture, what her alternative position is. She cribbed a lot of stuff on the website. Her website, to the extent that she has policy specifics, they're just cut and pasted from the Biden website, so it's not clear, if there is any, what's the Kamala difference? She keeps talking about turning the page, but it's not clear if or how she's actually different from Biden in terms of policy or what her governing agenda is. And in fact, a lot of the policies that she's put forward, the specific policies that she's put forward, do not suggest radical change from her predecessors, and some of them just disintegrate when you scrutinize them. So I'll give one quick example from the Compact piece, which is that she recently took to Kamala Harris recently took to social media and other platforms to say, I think the quote was something like, "For too long, unnecessary degree requirements have locked Americans out of prosperity, who have the skills and could learn the jobs. And so what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate superfluous degree requirements from federal jobs." And so that's a specific policy, and it's great because it's something that she could do as an executive that doesn't require congressional approval or anything like that. Okay. But then the simple fact that the executive can just do it whenever they want raises an interesting question of, why isn't it already done? It's almost an implicit rebuke of the Biden administration.
Kind of big hole in the argument.
Why haven't Biden? Is it that Joe Biden, of all people, is really committed to superfluous degree requirements? And then it turns out, when you dig just a little bit, that Trump already did this. Actually, Trump passed an executive order that eliminates superfluous degree requirements in federal jobs. And it would make sense Trump would do this because his primary base is non-college educated people. So it makes sense that would be on his radar. And so the fact that Kamala would then pledge to do this when it's already a fiat accompli raises interesting questions about, is it that she just doesn't know that this executive order has already been passed? That doesn't seem to speak well of Harris. Is it that she does know, but that she's trying to cynically take credit later for something that her opponent already did? That seems really terrible. Is it that she does know that it's already passed, but it hasn't been implemented well, in which case she wants to implement it better?
Right.
That serves as an indictment of the current administration that she's part of. They've been in power for 4 years. How have they not implemented this well yet? So there's really not a way to understand her taking this position that doesn't seem to indict her and Joe Biden. And if this is one of the rare cases where she puts something forward that's actually a concrete policy and it just disintegrates into ash the moment you scrutinize it, then it's a reasonable thing. It's a reasonable question for a lot of voters who are dissatisfied with the current administration or who just don't know where she stands compared to her opponent and what she would do about a lot of these problems they care about. It's a perfectly reasonable thing for them to maybe mistrust her or not be sure where she stands, especially because she has previously taken some of these really strong progressive issues on controversial cultural things that alienate a lot of these voters in the first place. So they have a pre-existing reason for mistrust, namely her questions, her kind of extreme positions in the past. And so, I think one of the things that favors Harris, though, in this cycle is that she's running against Donald flippin' Trump.
It's the secret weapon. The secret weapon is running against Trump.
He's not a policy wonk. He doesn't have firm plans. When he ran in 2016, he explicitly said, "I don't have any policies. I have loose suggestions." And I'll and so, she's running against Trump.
In a way, it was the original Vibes candidate, you could argue.
He was the original Vibes candidate. So she's running on Vibes. She's basically trying to copy his playbook and then coast on positive vibes and people's hate for Donald Trump, which is widespread, even on the Republican Party. There's a lot of people who have always hated Donald Trump, and the number has only grown. and he's deeply unpopular. He's been underwater his whole political life, and so this strategy of basically trying to not make any promises, not make any pledge, not provide any specifics, and just coast on vaguely aspirational positive messaging and their hatred of the other guy. It might even work. It might work. Like it might get her into office. It might work,
yeah. So, I mean, I guess the bottom line here is, yeah, it might work, though it seems like reading the campaign as best we can and reading Harris as best we can doesn't seem like the kind of stuff we're talking about in terms of the cultural alienation of the working class from the country and from the Democrats, the hegemony of the knowledge economy professionals, seems unlikely to change very much. So here's the last question for you. We've gone on for a while, and I could talk to you all day, but we won't do that. You've got other stuff to do, I'm sure. You're a busy man. But I would like to ask you this question. How does it end, if it ever ends? In other words, you make a very compelling case in your book that this stuff is all in their interests, the people who currently have hegemony. And we're not really seeing them giving up their privileges at this point. So why would they ever? Are we really just stuck with this for a very, very lengthy period of time? Or do you perhaps envision enough of a strong right backlash that it just blows it out of the water? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think, one prediction that people would be able to take from the historical account I tell in chapter 2 about the cyclical nature of these awakenings is that there will probably be another one of these when the conditions are right. We can expect that there might be another one of these. This one's winding down, but it probably won't be the last one. Wokeness probably won't be the term they use. There might be some other term in the same way that it was political correctness last time, it's wokeness today, and so on. The terms might change, but the structure of what's happening and what's driving it. Okay. So kind of left to our own devices, I think what we would expect to see is a repeat of this down the line. But there is this problem. As they say in military circles, the enemy has a veto or something like that. And so this is I think it's an open question of how sustainable the current situation is. The people who feel sociologically distant from us are increasingly the kind of mistrust in institutions, the mistrust in the process, the sense that it's actually increasingly impossible for them to achieve, like if they play by the rules, if they follow the usual process, then they're just doomed to lose. To the extent that people start feeling that way, then it increases the likelihood that they'll engage in forms of behavior and activism that could destabilize the system or cause it to collapse through violence, through an erosion of kind of normal democratic rules and norms, through illiberal policies that get passed when they do have power in the aftermath of some of these backlashes, and so on. And so I think it's a really dangerous situation a little bit. I think it's incumbent on us, even as the winners, if we want to keep winning, right. I think it's incumbent on us to really take seriously the frustration, the alienation, and the suffering of people who are who perceive themselves to be the losers in the knowledge economy, and find ways to talk to those people and speak to their concerns in a more serious way. If we don't, I think it will cause. I don't think the current thing that we're doing is sustainable over the long haul. Something's got to give.
I hear that, brother. I think that's a great way to end. So, knowledge economy professionals, symbolic capitalists out there, it's in your interest to try to damp some of this cultural alienation down and do things a bit differently. Don't guard your privileges and your language so severely. And I might add, you want to read this book, because that'll prepare you to be a better person and reach some of the folks who are culturally alienated. So again, we have never been woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite by the fabulous Musa Al-Gharbi. Thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast, Musa. And, talk to you again sometime, and, keep on doing the voodoo that you do. Your stuff is great.
Back at you. Your stuff is also really great. I've been following your work for a long time. It's been an honor.